Moving on to 60 and the 12-mark question. So, discuss the likely concerns of the Competitions Authority, so the CMA, regarding the proposed merger of two companies referred to in Extract C. So from our content knowledge, what are the main problems we know before we look at the extract of mergers, and why do the CMA block mergers? Why do they reject mergers? A great example is the Activision Microsoft merger that the CMA in the UK rejected. But why does this happen? And the main reason is the monopoly power. And what can these firms do with this increased market share, this now monopoly power they have? They can exploit consumers with that monopoly power. How do they do that? Another great example is a 302 merger. But this increased market share, the monopoly power, means that they can exploit consumers. Why? Since they own so much market share that when they increase prices, consumers are almost forced to buy from them, thus meaning that exploits consumers, worsens consumer welfare, surplus, etc. And that is, of course, something the CMA wants to avoid. What other problem arises from these mergers when these firms are in the same industry? So horizontal integration. So for example, with 302, what was the problem with that? Also, since these firms were in the same industry, they are likely to be competing with each other. Therefore, when they merge, they're no longer competing. So that can lead to a lack of competition. And a lack of competition is a great chain of analysis. You can pretty much direct it anywhere you want it to go, but main thing it leads to a lack of innovation, worsen quality, worsen consumer outcomes in the end. But let's have a look at Extract C to see what it is actually referring to. The serious concerns over the merger, and let's see if there's anything good in here. So this extract isn't the best, but I just want to make sure we really understand what's going on. So firstly, they've said this merger is going to reduce choice. That's a massive thing. Reduce choice for firms, reduce choice for consumers, and then of course it's also said it's going to push up prices. They can use these details for the application marks. Okay, so let's get started with the first paragraph. So how monopoly power is going to exploit consumers. But the way to get started with this, define and show your knowledge on CMA. So what is the CMA? The Competition and Markets Authority. They have merger policy. And what is merger policy? Is if the two merging firms are joining together and these firms have over a combined market share of over 25% or a combined annual turnover of over 70 million, the CMA launches a phase 1 investigation. And of course, these are two rivals joining from the UK and US, and then this is a 29.5 billion deal. So of course, this will be investigated. And why do they investigate it? To make sure consumers are protected and no one is being exploited. And why do the CMA block these mergers? As they judge that it's going to damage competition or it's going to exploit consumers. And here, knowing some real world application can really help. Like I said, Microsoft Activision, that was blocked. 302, that was also blocked. More recently, well, around 2021, Sainsbury's and Asda. Sainsbury's and Asda was 2019, sorry, just checked. But yeah, why was that blocked? They had a combined market share of 31%. So the CMA deemed that it could affect firstly competition, and then it could exploit consumers. Okay, so let's get started with this paragraph. So of course we're talking about monopoly power. We have to include the monopoly diagram. It's going to just emphasize and add to that, add so much more depth to that chain of analysis. Okay, so of course cost/revenue on your y-axis, output/quantity, whatever you want to put on your x-axis. Then let's just quickly get this diagram drawn. So D equals AR, MR, AC, MC. Quickly get profit maximization labeled up. Okay, so that's our box of super normal profit. Bang, bang, bang. So how would I word this paragraph? So one concern that the CMA may have regarding the proposed merger of these two companies is it could lead to exploitation of consumers. So that is my main point. Now, onto the application stage of the paragraph. So here, I'm just going to throw in some general applications. So like I said, I'll throw in the Sainsbury's as an example. They had 31% market share and the CMA rejected it. But now I'm going to go on to the chain of analysis. The CMA has launched an investigation into ARM and Nvidia and the 29 billion deal. Since, of course, the CMA investigates any merger over 70 million annual turnover. The reason why they want to be investigating this merger is the concerns with when these firms join, it could cause a degree of monopoly power. These rival firms merging will give them control to a significant proportion of the market share, meaning they can use that market share to now set prices. So of course they can set prices to whatever they want. So that is the monopoly power. Monopoly power, the quite literal definition, is a firm's ability to set prices. So they can set prices to P-max, the profit maximization price, and consumers have less choice. They're almost forced to buy it now since these firms control so much of the market share, thus meaning consumers are exploited other firms who buy these compute chips off Nvidia, off ARM, are now being exploited with higher prices. And of course, if you want to get technical with the diagram, what you can also label up, you can label up this triangle here. What does this triangle represent? This triangle represents the deadweight to welfare loss. And of course, that is why the CMA will have concerns about these mergers. But moving on to valuation. In what scenarios could these mergers be positive? So of course, we've drawn a monopoly diagram, we've labelled up the supernova profit, we have to mention it, and of course it is dynamic efficiency. And how can we use dynamic efficiency point here? So with these firms merging, they're of course going to be making large supernova profits, and if they choose to invest these supernova profits into research and development, they can therefore become dynamically efficient. Therefore, in the long run, so you could say, however, it depends on the time frame, as in the short run, yes, they will be exploiting consumers. However, in the long run, if they're investing into dynamic efficiency, it means the quality of goods are improving, and in the long run, it could mean goods become cheaper because they invest into research and development. Maybe they find a really cheap way to make these compute chips, thus allowing them to translate these reduced costs onto firms, onto consumers. So the long run benefits of dynamic efficiency could outweigh the short run costs of consumers being exploited. And this is a classic example of what Microsoft did. Microsoft had court cases where they were arguing that they were exploiting, that the court was arguing that Microsoft are exploiting consumers, but Microsoft argued that they're investing into dynamic efficiency. And of course, now we can see this, Windows computers everywhere, and it's like 40 years down the line, Microsoft would definitely, and they massively improve the quality of computers, of that technology. So you can really develop that dynamic efficiency point. Another massive one you could also talk about, so a positive of these mergers, is of course, the extract specifically mentions, these are, I think it specifically mentions, these are two of the largest firms, I believe it mentioned somewhere. So they're of course rival firms, but of course you can assume that they're massive by the 29.5 billion deal. So of course you could also mention the economies of scale. With Nvidia taking over ARM, they can maybe get these compute chips cheaper. They can exploit purchasing economy of scale larger. They can exploit more technical economy of scale, more marketing, more risk bearing. Essentially, they can exploit all the economies of scale to a further extent. Thus, meaning their longer average cost falls, meaning they become more and more efficient. So with lower costs, they therefore could translate this onto consumers, onto firms with lower prices. And of course, the extract actually just mentioned this as well. Large electronic firms benefit from economies of scale, and then it talks about marketing and technical. Also, another great point you could mention is a firm's objectives. So business objectives, since we're assuming that these firms will now use this market share to profit maximize, but instead, as we know from business objectives, they could revenue maximize, sales maximize, they could be actively efficient, they could be productively efficient, etc, etc. So they could pursue essentially lots of different pricing strategies, meaning consumers are not exploiting, thus acting as a really good evaluation to our original point. And that is more than enough evaluation for that first paragraph. Let's get started with the second paragraph, which of course the main point is lack of competition. Now, why is lack of competition a massive concern? And remember, this extract itself actually does state that these two firms are rival. The main problem with the lack of competition is firms become lazy. And what is the economic word for lazy? Is inefficient. So firms, like we can demonstrate on the diagram, they may become inefficient, or like we can of course see on just the economies of scale, they start suffering from diseconomies of scale. Since with no direct competitor, with no rival, it means there's no one pushing them to that new level. There's no reason to innovate. There's no reason to invest into new technologies. There's no reason to try cut your cost, since you're already on top of the market. But why does this concern the CMA? Since these higher costs, so for example, if Nvidia ARM is now suffering from diseconomies of scale, they have higher costs. These higher costs are likely to be passed on to the consumer in the forms of higher prices, and of course the lack of innovation, the lack of quality is also going to be affected by the consumer, less consumer welfare, less consumer surplus, which of course the CMA does want to avoid. So the main things to go into depth with there is inefficiency, diseconomies of scale, lack of innovation, which can lead to higher prices. Now moving on to valuation, how could we evaluate this? The way I would evaluate this is to do with barriers to entry. So we've said, okay, they've basically bought off, they've merged with their rivals, so they have no other competition. But however, it depends on the degree, it depends on the barriers to entry in that market. Since if in that market the barriers to entry are fairly low, it just means that these firms that merge together, a new firm could just enter and compete with this large merged firm. So the way I would evaluate this point is mentioning it depends on the levels of barriers to entry. What are some barriers to entry? Things like sunk costs, economies of scale, brand loyalty. As you can present the theoretical scenario, if barriers to entry are low, it means that yes, these firms are merged together, these are massive firms now, but new firms could enter the market and could therefore start competing with this new big NVIDIA ARM merged firm, thus stopping the concerns we had about the lack of competition. That is more than enough evaluation than you need for the 12 markers. So I've given you 4 points there, especially that dynamic efficiency point. If you develop it well, it will absolutely blow your examiner away. So yeah, that is how to complete the 12 mark question.